Welcome, conversing listeners. What is the credibility of the faith in a time like this? The Rethinking Church Initiative is launching a new podcast called Credible Witness.
I'm Nikki Toyamasito, and this is Credible Witness, a collection of stories and wisdom from faithful people wrestling with and bearing witness to the credibility of Christian life today. Each episode is an invitation to listen generously and courageously to one person, navigating social tension and moral complexity, negotiating doubts, struggles, and fears, overcoming obstacles and pursuing justice, and living out the convictions of their faith. And every voice reminds us that the church is called to be a credible witness to Christ, a living reality of hope, justice, truth, and love.
It's a beautifully rendered collection of stories that reward a courageous and generous listening. So please check out our show notes for links to the Credible Witness podcast feed, as well as crediblewitness.us. I'm hoping that you'll subscribe today, and I believe you'll be deeply encouraged by the series of episodes to come. Thank you for listening courageously with me, and may God bless this new effort.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. It seems like such a timely gift to have Elizabeth Neumann as our guest today on Conversing. Elizabeth currently serves as the Chief Strategy Officer for an organization called Moonshot, a social enterprise working to end online harms, such as violent extremism, child exploitation, and human trafficking. This organization has twice been named one of the world's most innovative companies by Fast Company magazine. Elizabeth is a national security expert who has served across 3 presidential administrations: on the inaugural staff of the White House Homeland Security Council under President George W. Bush, then advising the Office of the Director of National Intelligence during the Obama administration, and then as the Department of Homeland Security's Deputy Chief of Staff and Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention in the first Trump administration. Elizabeth is a frequent voice for national security issues and does so on television, in various periodicals and magazines and websites. She's also the board chair for the National Immigration Forum. Her first book was Kingdom of Rage, published in 2024. The title is The Rise of Christian Extremism and the Path Back to Peace. Elizabeth, what an honor and gift it is to have you as our guest today on Conversing.
I'm delighted to be here with you, Mark. Thanks for having me.
You know, we've had people of many, many different kinds on Conversing, but this is our first national security person. So you have a distinction. But let's go before the national security attributions. You were raised in Texas as a Christian and as a Republican. What was the order of those 3 words and the priorities of your family life, do you think?
My family, very, very grateful that my family rightly ordered our faith well before politics. But I will say that the bubble that I grew up in, the Christian bubble that North Texas is, definitely intermingled those two. To be a Christian meant that you were a Republican, and to be a Republican meant that you were a Christian. And that definitely was conflated for me until, about 10, 15 years ago. I had a number of moments where the Lord showed me the idolatry that I had been wedded to and the danger of that idolatry. And thankfully pulled me out of that to be able to prepare me for some difficult roads ahead of that moment. But yes, it's definitely in the water down there that you are one and the same in the Bible Belt sometimes.
I think that's one of the most confusing things about American life for people who don't live in that world. It's very hard to imagine how those things are entwined as they are. Not that entwined and even conflicting realities being entwined is an uncommon human experience, but those particular things being entwined is a particularly confusing thing, I think, in the landscape. So you're raised in this background, and I doubt that you grew up thinking you were going to be a security expert. So tell us that story. How did it happen that you came into the national security world? You came into political action first and then so forth, but tell us that arc.
Yeah, I had an affinity for government and politics, probably showing up around 5th or 6th grade, and definitely envisioned that I would go into politics, government. When I show up at the University of Texas at Austin in 1997, there's George W. Bush running for his second gubernatorial term, and I had the opportunity to work in the campaign apparatus for that election. And then he ran for president, and I had the opportunity to work on a presidential campaign as an intern, lowly intern. But when you work as a lowly intern and your guy wins, you get to go to Washington. So it was quite an amazing ride. And I had the opportunity to work on the faith-based initiatives for the first 2 years. If you remember George W. Bush's compassionate conservative agenda, I got to work on that. And then in the midst of that, 9/11 happened. And it drastically changed the agenda. We had been very focused on education reform, on welfare reform, and bringing faith communities into doing better for public services. And all of that was put on the back burner once 9/11 happened. And so I had an opportunity to work in the White House, initially in the White House counsel's office, helping with the 9/11 Commission document production. And then another role opened up in the Homeland Security Council, and I ended up working there. All of these are administrative junior staffer roles, but it created the opportunity to support a number of very senior people that were very generous in their mentoring and teaching, and then allowed me to step into policy, junior policy roles, and then more mid-level policy roles as the administration went on.
Right. Elizabeth, do you mind giving us a little bit more of a personal experience of 9/11 itself in light of your role, albeit as an entry-level person in the White House at one of the most extraordinary inflection points in American life? Just take us into that particular day for you.
Yeah, I just this week was talking to college students up on Capitol Hill. I went to DC earlier this week, and I love getting to do that. And I've been doing it for several years, and increasingly now when you ask, was anybody alive? Nobody was alive. College students were born several years after 9/11 now.
Wow.
And so I think it's incumbent upon us, those of us that lived through it, to let them know how devastating that day was. I was in DC on that day. I was commuting to the HUD building, Housing and Urban Development, which is where I worked. And I was crossing the bridge, 14th Street Bridge, when my mother called me in a panic. I could tell, how when your mother calls and you're just like, oh no, somebody has died, and you're thinking it's a family member, and she's saying there's a plane that's crashed into the World Trade Center. I'm scared. Can you go home? And it was only one plane at that point. And I thought she was overreacting. And I couldn't see the pictures, right? So there's this moment of like, it's going to be okay. Everything's fine here in DC. I will call you when I get to the office. By the time I got to that office, just, minutes later, the second plane had hit. And at that point, we were all glued to the TV going, oh my gosh, we're under attack. And then everybody's kind of going, what do we do? What do we, and as you're having that conversation, then you get word that the Pentagon's been hit. And so it all happened very fast. And then everybody's instinct kicks in, even though we know that the HUD building is probably not going to be on the target list. You just feel this panic of, I have to get out of this city. It's not safe. What if there are more attacks? It was just so unexpected that we felt so vulnerable, and we didn't know what was coming next. And so I was one of the few people that had driven to work that day. Nobody wanted to get on the metro. So I packed a bunch of people in the car. We tried to get out of the city. I lived in a normal afternoon commute. It would be, 20 to 30-minute drive. It took us 6 hours to get home. So in that time, you're just listening to the radio and all of the reports. We had my roommate lived at the White House. We knew that it had been evacuated. We couldn't reach her. None of the cell phone lines worked. So you're in this fog of war, very little information except what you can get on radio. You're watching the smoke, you're smelling the smoke as it's pouring out of the Pentagon. So many emergency vehicles, and in the moment as you're grappling with that, you're just kind of single-minded, focused on I got to get home. But certainly for my cohort, I was 22 years old, and I have no context to know about my own resilience or about our country's resilience. It's just scary. And I certainly leaned into my parents' faith. Like I had my own faith, but what do you do? And my life has been so golden and easy and compared to this moment, and leaned into those that I was working with that had more years who can turn around and say, this is horrible. And I've never seen anything like this, but we're going to get through it. And that, you just kind of learn to lean on other people who kept telling you, one day at a time, and we'll get through it. And it's a lesson I've treasured because I watched, as we went through the 2008 financial crisis and then COVID, the younger generations need to be told, this is hard and you will get through it. That's a really important thing for those of us with experience to turn around and hold their hand and say, yeah, this rocks us. It's rocking me. Like, this is hard, but Jesus will get us through this. Jesus is our rock in this moment. And I credit many of those saints around me that were both praying for me and encouraging me, and showing me the way, how you just take it one day at a time from there.
Wow. Well, I think people who have been through proximity to 9/11 events are all people who carry trauma, of course, and carry deep memories of different kinds that continue to, of course, like trauma does, it continues to linger in a body. It continues to linger in your mind. It's sometimes theorists of trauma will say it's sort of like shards of broken glass that could just periodically pierce whatever else is going on, and suddenly there it is again. Like it appears with a sharpness and a poignancy that can't always be directly related to anything that's going on around you, but that somehow the mind, the brain, the body provokes. As I've come to know you a bit through a group that you and I are in together, one of the things that I've wondered about is if your early experience with 9/11 began to shape a lifetime of work around international and national security. Are those as connected as one might imagine, or did it really unfold in a different way?
No, very much. It became I will do whatever I can do, answer phones, make copies. I don't have to do big things, just whatever I can do to make sure that this day never happens again for our country. And it becomes the thing that drives you, that it is guttural. It is instinctual, whatever it takes. And I remember reaching a moment probably around 2004, 2005, when I had somebody I worked with that we were in the same office together, same group, focusing on similar policy issues, but he was a detail from the CIA and probably in his late 40s or 50s. And he looked at me and he said, it's time for you to start rebuilding a cadence of normal, healthy life. And of course, saying that to somebody that works in the White House in any period of time is like, yeah, buddy, that's not how this works. You don't have a life when you're working in the White House. But what he really meant was not that the demands of a political job are intense, but like there was a drive of you can't give up. You have to just keep going because they're coming for you, right? It's fear driven.
Right. And
I remember we had several people with very real operational experience from special forces in the military, FBI agent, Secret Service agent, and they modeled for me what it looked like to be vigilant, but also know when you needed to rest, and that being with friends and family is really important to keep you healthy so that you can do your protective duties or be ready if you do need to surge. But it was a process for me to learn how to balance, probably my personality type also, Mark. I just was always going to be a workaholic, but you add to it the fear-driven motive, that mission, sense of purpose. It is still a battle for me today to find a work-life balance because it was so formative and so early in my career.
Well, and so much of your career, from what I've read about it, has been in moments where there's such high drama or such high stakes, even if it's not high drama, that the call is always on you to feel like whatever the next thing is, surely that's the thing I should be about, rather than anything that would seem distracting to that, like a life. Family.
Very true. There is a golden period that I was able to enjoy almost 10 years. And it was a period when God was doing a lot of work in me personally and kind of deepening my faith and showing me idols that I needed to give up, and that I was trying to do life on my own terms instead of submitting to him. And I met my husband after some of the most intense work was done, and we got married and had children pretty quickly thereafter. And so all of those things brought their own intensity, but their own sweetness. But you're right. Then I got the call to go back into government in the Trump administration, and originally turned that down several times. And it was somebody calling a couple of days before the inauguration saying, there are threats that I can't talk about on this line and I need help. And most of the people coming in don't have experience and I don't know who I can trust. Will you please come in? And then you're like, oh, now you've tugged on my mission heartstring and I can't say no to that. And so, we moved our family back to Washington and served another tenure then. But the mission is always a pull for me.
So twice you've referred to this period of sort of unmasking your idols. Tell us about what that involved and what the idols were.
Yeah. So the verse that I had this moment of reckoning with was in Jeremiah 17:5-8, which is a kind of a repeat or a restatement of Psalm 1, but the way that it's framed in Jeremiah was much more piercing for me, because it's like, blessed is the person whose trust is the Lord, and the trust is the Lord, and he will be like a tree planted by the water, whose fruit will bear even in season and in drought, in times of drought. And you're like, oh yeah, that's like Psalm 1. But the next two verses are like, cursed is the man whose trust is in man. And Psalm 1 talks about the fool and putting your trust, but this is like a lot more direct about
confrontational, really.
Yes, very confrontational. And in the context of Jeremiah, where he is calling out all of the ways in which Israel is not following the Lord, and they think they are, but he's pointing out all of the ways in which they have abandoned the Lord and disobeyed the Lord. And for some reason, that verse just jumped out at me, and I realized how much my hope and trust had been in man, in not a specific person, but just in man can figure this out. We can solve these problems. Like, I'm a public policy person. We go into work excited about problems and trying to come up with evidence-based solutions. So this idea that is something to be cursed was very jarring for me and forced me to kind of pull back some layers of, where do I really anchor my hope? And then a few years later, I heard a sermon from our mutual friend, Russell Moore, who, this is like 2015 timeframe, and he came to the church we were attending and taught about how especially in the South, the church have really wrapped the flag around the cross, and that this is a form of idolatry and we really need to be careful. And I have to tell you, my husband and I were like, but we've always had a flag at the front of the auditorium. And I grew up in a Christian school. We pledged allegiance to the American flag and the Christian flag, and it was all one thing. And it was very much like, take your snow globe and shake it up. And And because it was so convicting, we knew what he was preaching was right, but it really forced you to take a look at, well, what else have I been told growing up that is the right answer? And actually, when somebody connects dots, like, hey, by the way, here's all of the scriptures that tell us that this is not how it should be. And so it kind of put us, both my husband and I, on a journey of kind of uncovering other things that we just presumed were true because that was the culture we grew up in, and things that were actually Republican policies were framed as like the morally, biblically correct thing. And, piecemeal, you're starting to go like, oh my gosh, I've been lied to. And I don't think anybody that I know personally was intentionally lying. I want to be really clear. It's cultural. Like our culture, especially in the South, it's just very much a one and the same. So if you're a good Christian, then you have to be pro-death penalty, of course, because that's the Republican Party's position. Of course, nobody says it that way, but that's actually the subtext is like whatever the Republican Party platform is, that must be what the Bible teaches too, right? As opposed to, going, well, how does God see this picture? And I will say that I have come to a place of not necessarily knowing the answers for all these tough questions, but being much more comfortable with taking a non-position. Like, I don't know. I think if I were ever in a role where I had to make a decision about that, I'd have to pray a lot. I don't actually know what the right answer is. And I've become much more comfortable with the gray as opposed to the black and white that I had been raised on.
Yes, yes. I've often pointed out how significant it is to me that at the end of 1 Corinthians 13, that great text that's often imprisoned in wedding ceremonies, Paul, the most adamant voice in the New Testament, is the voice that says we see, but we see through a glass darkly. Yes. And so much of what is happening in that kind of cultural formation that you were describing is this sense that we see transparently. Yes. And we assume that nothing is really filtering our vision. It's just, we're just being neutral. This is how most people actually interpret most things, right? We presume that we're the neutral viewer and that what's happening is therefore ours to name and to respond to. But so often when we really come to understand how much our life has actually been shaped by a whole interpretive frame that has caused us to pretend that we see, or to lead us to think that we perceive transparently when we really actually don't. We see sufficiently. Paul's not saying we don't see. He's just saying we don't see transparently. It's not absolutely plain. It is sufficiently clear to call it sight and knowledge and legitimize trust, but it is not complete, it's not finished, and it's certainly not transparent. So there's this, yes, and we hold ourselves, right? So part of what Christian humility in this moment that we're living through right now, that feels so important for us to recover, is this interpretive humility. I get to look at the facts, I get to experience people's opinions, the raw data of whatever it is that is happening, whatever it is that I come to be able to experience and have access to. And I am a steward of a greater kind of knowing, which is really measured by the character of God's knowing, which is not your mind, and it's not my mind, and it's not the collective mind, and it's certainly not the mind of any particular political leader. And it's that dance that I think is so enlivening, actually, to being human, but frankly taps into those anxieties that you were describing, the fears, the sense of, but I need more assurance than that. I want to be sure that I do know certainly. And I think what the Bible offers us is assurance that we know sufficiently. And God is absolute, but my view of God isn't absolute, right? Those kinds of distinctions that I think feel to me not at all like they're liberalizing, quote unquote, influences. They're just humble influences of realizing that we're not where we sometimes want to project ourselves to be. I'm curious, Elizabeth, if you can just take us a little bit further. So As this unfolds and you begin to experience this dismantling in a certain way of a framework that had tied things together that you were now beginning to realize needed to be analyzed separately and evaluated differently than you grew up thinking. Was there a moment or a series of moments that felt to you like really like, oh, this is it. Now the game is up. I must start all over, or I now see in a way that's like regaining sight or losing the blinders.
Yeah, as it pertains to the Lord, no. Like, as things were, I know there are a lot of people, the popular word is deconstruction. A lot of people that deconstruct and that focuses on and affects their relationship with the Lord. I would say I was deconstructing my cultural understanding of faith, and as I was doing that, it drew me closer to the Lord. And I had before all of this started, a pretty intense period of the Lord, exposing to me that I was not submitting to him, and in that process, his wooing of me, and, kind of rebuilding a relationship with him that gave me a very solid foundation from which when he reveals this, you're like, oh, okay, we're going to deal with that now, Lord. Okay. I've been through these things with you before. This is uncomfortable. I don't know where it's going to end up, but you're with me. So, and I'm just going to be obedient to it. And I appreciate that that's not everybody's path. But for me, though it was externally shaky, it was, solid as a rock. I also was very blessed that my husband was going through this at the same time.
Yeah, sharing the same journey. Yeah.
I have met many who, especially during that COVID period, was a good shaking for a lot of people. And when you're not on the same place, that's really, really hard. So yes, as some of these layers became more apparent, I think I had two reactions. One, I'm in this process of discovery, and I think there were quite a few of us that were particularly watching the party that we had grown up with change before our eyes. Like, even by 2015, before Donald Trump was the nominee, there were conversations like, man, this is like there's a shift here. Like, we couldn't. No, I did not think that Trump would win. All of us thought the normal rules of politics would apply in 2016, and we were all clearly wrong. But you could tell that something had shifted. And then when you had him win, I think I was mildly hopeful that he would get into office and he would behave like a normal president. And, I got a front row ticket to watch how that did not happen. So, that was quite a wild ride, concerning from mainly the vantage point I was coming at it from was national security. And we all adapted and coped. And I really did not have a moment, Mark, to think too much beyond just the next day and survival and, Lord, what are you calling me to do here? And do I need to say no to things? And, how do I help my boss navigate situations where they're likely to get fired if they say no, but it's illegal for them to do the thing they've been told to do? So, I mean, it is minute by minute survival mode for about 3.5 years. And I happened to leave April 2020. I'd been pushed out because I had said no too many times. And what a blessing that I got to escape. But that's like the height of COVID shutdown. I come home, my kids are out of school, I'm homeschooling and sleeping and catching up on sleep, and then starting to process the trauma. And somebody wisely that had left before I had pulled me aside and was like, you don't understand this yet, but you're going to need counseling and therapy for everything that we've been through. And I was like, okay. She was like, give yourself time. And she was right. I needed both a lot of rest, but then a lot of time to process. And right as I was dealing with that, the George Floyd protests happened. And what I was watching from the outside was crumbling of some of the guardrails that many of us had worked so hard to make sure would stay in place. And that was frightening to me. I was like, oh my gosh, this is falling much faster than I thought. And
you're referring, just to be clear, you're referring to what in particular were the guardrails and what was falling?
I think many of us that served in the first Trump administration went in with pure intent of he is a duly elected president of the United States. He deserves to have his policies implemented, provided that they're lawful and constitutional. And so we viewed our role as advisors as like, okay, tell us what you want to accomplish. Okay, great. This is how you do it. And so a very real life example, when he was very into force as a deterrent, he would suggest things like, can I shoot people from the border wall we're building? No, you cannot. Here's the law enforcement guidance. You can't shoot somebody unless they're posing a threat to law enforcement. And another one was, you have to remember, he is, all about the optics, all about the staging of things. And so he was really invested for a period of time in the idea that we should build a moat on the border with alligators in it. And so we had to do a quick little drill of like, is that feasible? And as you might know, most of the southern border is desert and alligators don't do well in deserts. So we were able to move that off the discussion. But those were the types of things that we would routinely get thrown our way. And he was elected, so we need to give you an answer. But often what we're doing is we're saying, it sounds like you're trying to achieve this. Here are some lawful ways, and here are some practical ways where you could achieve your goal. And that worked for a while, Mark. Like, he was okay initially, and then he would get frustrated because the way government works, it's slow. You have to get Congress to pass laws and give you money. And he really did not like that he had to wait for Congress to act. And
what was it in the George Floyd? Sorry, what was it in the George Floyd case that was you saw crumbling?
So what we saw in the George Floyd case is he was starting to suggest things that would be improper for law enforcement and the military to do, and was starting to some of the people were starting to go and do those things. So the classic example is in Lafayette Square, which is right in front of the White House. There were a number of protests, and he decided he wanted to walk and stand in front of St. John's Church, which is on the other side of the square. And in order to do that, Secret Service needs to clear the square. That's completely reasonable. And the reason he was going to see St. John's Square was because rioters had caused damage to the church the day before. Now, the church still stood, but it had some fire damage. So in order to clear the square, they sent in law enforcement with riot gear, tear gas crowds that were at the time peaceful. They were not rioting. And they swooped in helicopters, military helicopters, very low over Lafayette Square in a way that, it's an urban environment. You just don't usually, it's not safe for helicopters to fly that low. So it was very intimidating. And as you can imagine, if you're a protester, you're like, this is not what we do to protesters. First you give warning, hey, we need to clear the square. And then if you don't clear the square, then you're going to be talked to. And then if you, as a last resort, you put people in riot gear and then you clear the square. But you don't swoop in helicopters. It was just so bizarre. And that's the same photo op, if you might remember, where Mark Milley as a general walks out and the Secretary of Defense walks out, and they didn't quite know where they were going or why they were walking out. But then, to their credit, they later apologized. They said, we should not have been there. That was a political thing. We are not political. We were not trying to show military force. But it was one of those moments where you're like, oh, this went sideways fast, that the normal people that would have been in place to say, hey, we can't do it that way, but we can do it this way, were gone. And his worst instincts were being allowed to manifest.
So fast forward, a lot has happened. There's obviously a term of Joe Biden. There's varieties of national responses to his leadership. The immigration issues, in many people's mind, dramatically shift. They escalate in scale and in a lack of, it seems, sufficient border control and a lack of plan, really. It's more like it feels like a flood in many parts of the country. And it's very hard to know what to do about that. So the thought that there is a crisis, that there needs to be a response to the crisis, that even if, as I do, you have a compassionate policy toward immigrants and that you believe in law and order and you believe in a really good, robust, holistic, compassionate immigration law and practice. You still now, at this moment, don't have any of those things. You just have sort of national chaos, this feeling that immigrants are coming in from and everywhere at any time. And the country is understandably, especially in certain regions of the country, really up in arms about this. And then that is Trump, enters the stage. And as that has happened, and now fast forward from there to the events of the week that we're actually having this conversation, which is the week after the shooting of Alex Pretti in Minneapolis and the demonstration of 50,000 people at 35 degrees below zero protesting ICE's action. Just give us a sense of what are the themes that you're seeing? What are the major warning signs? You've been writing a lot, and we'll put a couple of articles in the show notes so that people can actually read what you have recently written. But take us into that in light of what you've just said about St. John's Church and all of that.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly was very concerned. I was concerned in 2020 during his reelection, and then again in 2024 when he tried to run again, that in a second term, there are no more guardrails. He doesn't have to pretend anymore. And he learned that the guardrails, meaning the graybeards, the people with experience, they don't give in to me. And so I was very concerned we would see what we have since seen. Perhaps, arguably, a 2024 presidency being much more damaging than a 2020 presidency would have been, because his team has had 4 years to prepare. And in particular, as it pertains to immigration, Stephen Miller is his chief architect for all things immigration. He was the one directing everything in the first administration. So child separation, building a wall, reductions in the refugee ceiling, changes to, reducing the amount of available visas. That's all him. And so you give him 4 years, and now he can come back and has planned remarkably for implementing on multiple fronts his agenda. And I think that's what we're seeing play out. There's not too much that I've seen that I've been surprised by. However, I think there are things that have caved faster than it disheartens me. I was hoping certain institutions would have more spine and stand up to the administration, or certain parts of the government the culture wouldn't shift as fast as it shifted. And I think in particular what we're watching with ICE and CBP, both of which, maybe I should say those acronyms fully. So ICE is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, and CBP is Customs and Border Protection. Both of those are components of DHS. So in my role at DHS, I worked with people at those agencies on certain counterterrorism policies. I never did immigration policy directly. I did more of the adjacent side of making sure that our vetting systems are strong, and that when we're admitting refugees, that we're comfortable that they don't pose a threat to the United States. So it was adjacent to their work. What we have kind of all witnessed this last week with the shooting, now the third shooting in 3 weeks, 2 people have died. That is unprecedented in federal law enforcement history. You would have to go back decades to come up to a point in time when we had federal law enforcement be so aggressive. That's in part because there were a lot of reforms put into place in the 1970s when it became discovered that the FBI had been doing a whole host of things they shouldn't have been doing, and we had a bunch of reforms in the Church Commission that have carried over to all forms of federal law enforcement. So the things that I have felt compelled to speak out about is what I'm watching is a drastic shift in an agency that has a really, really important mission. The Department of Homeland Security birthed out of 9/11 in order to keep us safe. Arguably, lots of mistakes have been made, lots of room for improvement, but we haven't had another 9/11. And so there are things that I can look back on the last 25 years and say, yes, we kept the country safe. And I think there's, like I said, plenty of room for improvement, but it's an important agency. It's not something you can just say, we can go back to pre-9/11 days and get rid of some of this. So when I'm watching agencies get treated the way that they're being treated, all of a sudden, the American public rightly does not trust these agencies. And in a democracy, it does not work if we, the people who are being governed, I mean, like the whole concept of democracy is by the consent of the governed. So if we are withdrawing our consent and saying, no, you are violating the Constitution, like there are 3 constitutional amendments that they are consistently violating daily in their execution of their immigration enforcement, like that is unacceptable.
And those 3 things would be
First Amendment. Second Amendment, that was the kind of the newer one, this idea that apparently, if you have a conceal and carry license, you're not allowed to carry if there are immigration enforcement operations happening nearby. Like that's, I don't know where they came up with that, but that's what they've kind of been articulating and maligning Mr. Pretti. And then Fourth Amendment, that's the amendment that prevents unlawful searches and seizures. And we now know that that ICE has issued an internal memo, it's not public, that has authorized ICE agents and anybody deputized under ICE to be able to carry out basically warrantless searches. They're called administrative warrants, which means they haven't gone before a judge. They haven't proved to a judge that there is actual probable cause for you to pull somebody over and look inside their car or go into their home or their business. And so that has been happening at scale in Minneapolis, and that the fact that they are violating the Fourth Amendment is a huge problem. So we now have an agency, and then supplementing that agency, it's ICE, right? These are ICE authorities that they're trying to enforce. But supplementing, they're bringing in Border Patrol and customs officers, neither of whom are trained to work inside the interior of the United States. Like, let me tell you, the Border Patrol does some really cool stuff. But it's military type stuff. We send them overseas to help other militaries figure out how to patrol their borders. Like they are, hardcore guys. They do not need to be in the middle of the United States policing our streets. Like they have a completely different training. They don't know how to de-escalate. They don't know how to handle peaceful protesters or even annoying protesters, which, by the way, are lawful. You can be annoying when you protest. You can blow a whistle. There is nothing that makes that, something punishable by arrest, let alone murder. So there is a mismatch here where we have put people into circumstances that they are not trained for. And in the middle of all of this, Mark, I think the thing that breaks my heart the most, there's been a massive upsurge in hiring at ICE. They have more than doubled their workforce, 120% in about 5 months. It's unprecedented. Government doesn't move that fast, so the systems are breaking. In order to do this, they had to stop vetting as strongly as they vet law enforcement officers. That's a big problem. That can lead to corruption, and maybe they're associated with, other crimes or other extremist groups. Vetting's kind of an important thing when you're hiring law enforcement. Every other law enforcement agency vets pretty rigorously. And then training. Training has been cut at least in half. Some reports are saying by 77%. So you are putting a whole cadre of new officers who don't know the culture, don't know the law, they haven't been trained properly, and you're putting them into really volatile situations. And so you don't have this training. And here's the last piece, Mark. You are being told in every stand-up meeting which is something that law enforcement does when they go on shift. You have a meeting where everybody huddles. Here's what our focus is today. Here's anything that happened overnight that you need to be aware of. They're being told that they are being targeted and hunted and that everybody hates them and they're going to come get you. And it creates an enemy, us, them mentality. Rather than thinking of themselves as law enforcement officers here to protect the public, they now see the public as an enemy. So we literally are creating a culture much more akin to a military experience. Like I am, a member of the Army going into Fallujah to assert control over a terrorist haven. And that is the mentality that is coming from the top. I mean, if you look at the rhetoric that's coming out of the White House, the social media posts that they put out, the memes they put out, what they say from the podium to the Secretary of Homeland Security, and then all of the senior leaders of these agencies, it is aggressive rhetoric. They take pleasure in cruelty. I'm not making this up. This is they actually will say, yeah, cruelty is a deterrent. So they use cruelty to try to prevent people from coming here, or they think maybe they'll self-deport. So it is a strategy, a tactic to be aggressive, to be cruel, and to keep telling these men and women, hey, the next protester might try to kill you. You need to be really careful. And so think about that. Like, if every day you're waking up and going out on the street to carry out whatever your assignment is, but you've been indoctrinated to think the next protester it might kill me, that of course you're going to be quick on the trigger. It's not surprising to me, having discovered some of the what's happening on the inside, that we have these 2 shootings in a matter of weeks. And in cases where, like, with our own eyes, we can go, oh my gosh, this was not justifiable and this was totally preventable. So I want to be really clear. I am not excusing those officers. They need to be investigated. They need to be held accountable. But I also actually feel tremendous empathy for a workforce that has been indoctrinated and propagandized into a place that's actually making them less safe, making the public less safe. It is a horrible moment in the history of DHS. And so I and many of people who've worked at DHS and worked in national security are asking for a stand down. Like, the only way to address this is you need to stop immediately and go back to the basics. Everybody needs to get trained. We need to take away this aggressive cruelty is the point rhetoric and actions. We need to go back to the basics of how you do good law enforcement. I don't have tremendous hope that this administration is going to do that, but I think it's absolutely well within our rights as citizens to demand that the government that we elected, that is supposed to be serving and protecting us, adhere to the rule of law.
Right. Amen. So I think one of the things, there's so many things about all this that are just so tragic and so difficult to understand, but, the legitimacy of trying to, as it were, quote, weed out genuine criminals among immigrant population is a task which seems like it's completely lost amid what has become this marauding, random ransacking of people's lives. And in the days that I was in Minneapolis, I had opportunities to witness things that were just completely violating to the First, Second, and Fourth Amendments, and which were utterly terrorizing to the people that were involved, none of whom were in any way criminals. They happened to be bystanders in a place, or they happened to be protesters, peaceful protesters. There was nothing that was going on that I could see or discern that justified anything other than just the appropriate policing response. Like, we're investigating these things. Thank you. Sorry to bother you. Move on. But nothing like the intense terror that they were striking in the people that I met and that I saw. So I think one of the things that is so urgent about this moment is that I think some people are hearing in the protest action, oh, you don't want to protect the vulnerable people in the United States that have been injured by the violence of criminal immigrants. Okay, nobody's arguing against the legitimacy of trying to bring that under control. But the tactics are the thing that feels, and the culture, the subculture that you're describing vividly, feels like that is the nub of the crisis, which then, of course, causes so many people around the country to explode with acts of compassion, but also explode with acts of anger and frustration against a government that seems to be bent on simply having its own way and making its own show rather than actually accomplishing a just end. Is that fair?
I think it is fair. I think we have to look at the actions, which is why you could say something immediately on Sunday once it became clear that there was no excuse for this killing. I mean, it was so beyond the pale that he was killed that you can immediately say, like, I don't know the totality of the circumstances here, but I know that something has gone wrong, and that's why we need to stand down, and you need to let the investigations happen. Let, like, an independent third party come in and tell you, like, what went sideways here, because this is not normal and this is not okay, as opposed to what they're currently doing, which is continuing. Granted, it sounds like some of the hostility is not as intense, but but they're still there. And it's still the same workforce. They're still the same people under tremendous pressure to hit arrest quotas. And they're angry because they've been told to be angry. So like, it's still a potential powder keg. Like I have to say, like, if I were Susie Wiles and the chief of staff, I'd be like, oh gosh, let's get everybody out there before something else happens, because the rails might come off of this presidency if we have a third thing happen, right? Like politically speaking, you have to be thinking about the calculus here and going, oh, wow, they have lost multiple news cycles at this point trying to accomplish whatever they wanted to accomplish. And they have a 2026 election cycle that they need to worry about. And they're bogged down in Minneapolis. So why not just pull everybody out? Like, it's actually really funny to me that whether you look at it through the political lens, like how do you deal with this? Or just like the practical, what is good law enforcement lens, none of the answer is like, oh, let me just swap the commanders out, which is what they've done. They took Greg Bidivino off of the press conference circuit because he was too provocative. And he was a jerk on stage. And then they put in Tom Homan, who is very firm. I worked with Tom during my time at DHS. He is as he appears. But he's also, and he was sent there, this is a quote from Trump, he was sent there to de-escalate a little bit. So you're watching this press conference that happened Thursday morning, and Homan is acknowledging that maybe, things haven't gone perfectly, and we need to, work better, and I've got good constructive meetings with the governor, and we're gonna work towards drawing down troops. And you're like, This feels like you're saving face, but not actually doing anything of substance that needs to be done to actually address the core systemic problems. So I'm actually a little befuddled at why this was the path they chose, other than the fact that Stephen Miller is the primary driver of all of this. Like, he has a vision of what he's trying to accomplish, and so he has a lot of power. And my guess is that he was able to kind of come up with like, well, we'll send Tom in and the optics will look better, Mr. President. And that's maybe how we got to the current moment. But I don't think, Mark, that this has to play out the way that these things usually play out, which is they go too far, and then the president goes, oh, this is what I meant. And then they remove somebody, and then they back up. And then they go too far. This is the cycle they go through. This feels different to me. The American people are really upset. And it does feel like if we maintain the pressure on members of Congress or representatives, that we need more. We need more than just a, rotation of who's doing the press conference. We actually need to see substantive change here. It could be that this might be an inflection point where we could achieve real change. Mildly optimistic about that, not overly optimistic, but I think we still need to speak out and let our representatives know what we expect from our government.
Right. Well, I was part of a gathering on Thursday of last week of about 1,000 clergy from across all different faiths who gathered together to get ready for the march on Friday. And it was extremely well done, extremely peaceable, no sense of violence, no sense of that sort of boiling over anger, no sense of rage, just a sense that it was utterly wrong what was going on, and that this had to be brought to some kind of change, if not stop. And hence the signs of getting out of Minneapolis, getting ICE out. And I found it a very, very unifying thing across the state of Minnesota and certainly in Minneapolis itself, where it felt like this was not a movement of people that were against law and order or were against finding criminals or against. There's nothing like that in the conversation. It was just like, this is actually evil that is being perpetrated by our government against its own citizens. Elizabeth, I feel like our conversation could go on for hours because I have so many more questions, and I'm sure our listeners have so many more questions that they would wish that we had time to talk about. Maybe another time I'll have a chance to pick it up. But I'm very grateful for your personal transformation. And I think that for a lot of people, it's an important story to hear, because it often, when you're not inside the mega universe, it's very hard to understand how it operates and why it operates with the kind of control that it does. The same thing can be said of the left. I'm not, I'm not trying to target only the right. There's problems on extremes of both ends. But I also am extremely grateful for your courage, your leadership, your clarity, your moral and spiritual clarity, as well as your actual leadership in the context that you've served in and continue to try to support. So thank you very, very much for being here today. And we join together, I know, in praying for peace and justice in our country. God bless you,
Mark.
And thanks again.
I appreciate it. And I appreciate your friendship. Thank you for your leadership. And yeah, let's keep pressing for change.
Amen. Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.